The office building loomed tall against the cloudy sky, its glass windows reflecting the city below. Inside, the air was thick with tension. In a room on the top floor, a group of 11 lawyers huddled around a large table, papers scattered everywhere. The CEO stood at the head of the table, rubbing his temples. He had been watching this legal issue drag on for months, and every attempt to solve it had failed. Contracts had loopholes, regulations were confusing, and every solution seemed to hit a dead end. The lawyers argued back and forth, each trying to prove that their plan was the right one, but nothing was working. The problem was complicated, and the stakes were high. If the issue remained unresolved, the company could face huge losses, legal battles, and public embarrassment. The CEO felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The board members were impatient, and the employees whispered in the hallways, worried about what might happen next. Every day brought more stress and more questions, but no answers. Meanwhile, far from the high towers and busy offices, a young woman wiped down tables in a small diner. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, and her uniform was simple, but her eyes were sharp and observant. She noticed things that others often missed. The way people reacted, the way a story didn't quite fit together, small details that seemed insignificant but could make all the difference. Life had taught her to pay attention, to listen carefully, and to think quickly. She didn't have a fancy degree or a title that would impress anyone in the corporate world, but she had something just as valuable: a mind that could see patterns and solve problems. She worked long hours, serving coffee and meals, smiling politely even when the day was hard. Some customers treated her like she was invisible, talking over her or ignoring her advice. But she had learned to notice them anyway, to quietly observe and understand without needing recognition. One busy morning, as she moved between tables, she overheard a conversation at the counter. A man was on the phone, his voice tight with frustration. He mentioned contracts, a CEO, and lawyers who couldn't seem to fix something. Something about the words caught her attention. She paused, pouring coffee, and listened a little longer. The man hung up and shook his head, muttering to himself about how impossible it all seemed. Later that day, a friend of the CEO came into the diner. She didn't know him personally, but he recognized her from the regular crowd. He sat down with a tired smile and ordered lunch. They talked casually about the city, the weather, and life in general. Then, somehow, the conversation turned to the company. The friend sighed, clearly frustrated. He explained that the CEO and his team of lawyers had been working for months on a problem that seemed impossible to solve. He described contracts, missing clauses, and conflicting regulations. The waitress listened quietly, nodding occasionally. She didn't interrupt, but her mind was racing. She was thinking about what he said, connecting dots, imagining scenarios, and noticing details that even the experts might have overlooked. That evening, after the diner closed and the customers had gone, she sat at a small table in the back, scribbling notes on a napkin. Her hands moved quickly as ideas formed in her mind. She drew simple diagrams, wrote down possibilities, and imagined the problem from different angles. It was challenging but exciting. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a solution that nobody else had seen. She thought about all the people in that office, the stressed lawyers, the worried CEO, and she wanted to help. The next morning, she returned to the diner early, determined to explore her ideas further. She studied the notes she had made, refining her thoughts, thinking logically and creatively at the same time. She imagined herself in the boardroom, explaining her solution clearly and calmly. In her mind, she practiced the steps she would take, the way she would present her reasoning, and the questions people might ask. The more she thought about it, the more confident she became. She knew that her perspective was different from the lawyers because she wasn't limited by traditional thinking. She could see connections they couldn't, notice details they had overlooked, and consider human behavior alongside the legal technicalities. Days passed, and she continued to refine her ideas. She couldn't shake the feeling that this problem was solvable, even if it seemed impossible to everyone else. Her friends at the diner noticed that she seemed distracted, scribbling notes during breaks and muttering to herself occasionally. They didn't fully understand what she was doing, but they could see the determination in her eyes. She had a quiet confidence that was growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, the CEO himself walked into the diner. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of weeks of failed attempts on his shoulders. He ordered a coffee and sat down at the counter, speaking briefly with the waitress. They exchanged polite words, small talk about the weather and the busy city streets. But she noticed the tension in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted, and the worry in his eyes. Something about him reminded her of the importance of the problem, and she felt a sense of urgency. As she handed him his coffee, she hesitated for a moment. Something inside told her that this was the chance she had been waiting for. She took a deep breath and spoke, softly but clearly. She mentioned a small detail she had noticed from the conversation she had overheard, a detail that seemed minor but could be the key to solving the larger problem. The CEO raised an eyebrow, surprised that a waitress could make such an observation. He asked her to explain further, curious despite himself. She explained her thoughts step by step in simple, logical terms. She didn't use complicated legal jargon, but she described patterns, connections, and possibilities that no one else had considered. The CEO listened intently, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. The idea seemed too simple, almost too obvious, yet it carried a weight that made him pause. He felt a mixture of skepticism and hope, unsure whether to take this seriously but intrigued enough to ask more questions. The waitress continued, calmly addressing each concern he raised. She showed him how her insight could fit into the existing contracts and regulations, highlighting the small adjustments that could make everything work. Her explanation was clear, concise, and surprisingly persuasive. The CEO found himself nodding slowly, thinking about how the solution could actually succeed where months of expert effort had failed. By the end of the conversation, the CEO was both impressed and shocked. He had never expected such clarity from someone outside the legal field. He asked for her contact information, wanting to review her ideas more carefully. The waitress smiled politely, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She knew that the real test was still ahead, but she also knew that her perspective had opened a door that no one else had been able to unlock. That evening, she returned home and reviewed her notes once more. She felt a sense of pride in her work, knowing that she had approached the problem with honesty, observation, and careful thinking. She didn't boast and she didn't expect recognition, but she felt a quiet confidence that she was on the right path. The city lights twinkled outside her window, and she imagined the boardroom, the lawyers, and the CEO reviewing her idea, slowly realizing that the solution had been there all along, just waiting for the right perspective. Meanwhile, in the office high above the city, the CEO called a private meeting with a few trusted advisors. He spoke cautiously about an idea a waitress had suggested, a simple observation that might solve the impossible problem. Some advisors laughed quietly, others shook their heads, but the CEO remained thoughtful. He knew that months of expert failure had left him desperate for a solution, and this new approach, unconventional as it was, deserved a chance. As the sun set over the city, the waitress closed the diner, wiped down the counters, and walked home with a sense of quiet purpose. She had taken the first step toward something much bigger than herself, something that could change lives and defy expectations. She didn't know how the story would end, but she felt ready to face whatever came next, armed with her observations, her courage, and her determination to see what others could not. The night was calm, but the city hummed with possibility. Somewhere in the office, lawyers would soon confront a challenge that even they could not solve, and a solution, born from the eyes and mind of someone completely unexpected, was quietly taking shape. The stage was set for a story that no one would forget, a story that would prove that wisdom, insight, and courage are not confined to titles, degrees, or positions. And in a small apartment far from the skyscrapers, a waitress dreamed of the moment when her simple observation could change everything. The next morning, the waitress arrived at the diner early, her mind buzzing with ideas. She had barely slept, thinking about the conversation with the CEO and how her simple observation might make a real difference. The sun had just begun to peek through the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the empty streets. As she prepared the coffee and cleaned the tables, she imagined the office above the city and the team of lawyers still struggling with the impossible problem. She felt a strange mixture of nervousness and determination. This was bigger than anything she had faced before, and yet she could feel that she had a unique chance to help. Later that morning, the CEO walked into the diner again, looking more composed but still carrying the weight of the issue on his shoulders. He ordered his usual coffee and glanced at the waitress with a curious look. She greeted him politely, but this time she noticed something different. He seemed more open, more willing to listen. The previous day, she had only spoken briefly, but today she knew it might be the moment to offer more insight. As he sipped his coffee, she found the courage to start a casual conversation, asking how the meeting with his advisors had gone. He hesitated for a moment, then confessed that they had been skeptical, some even dismissive, but he had found her suggestion interesting enough to consider it further. His tone carried both relief and frustration. The lawyers had failed, and now he was grasping for any solution that could work. Her heart quickened as she listened, realizing that she might be able to guide him toward a real answer. She asked a few careful questions, listening to the CEO describe the problem in detail. He explained the contracts, the clauses that didn't make sense, and the regulations that seemed to contradict each other. As he spoke, she took mental notes, quietly organizing the information in her mind. She noticed patterns, small inconsistencies, and points where human behavior might affect the situation. Her mind worked quickly, connecting ideas that seemed unrelated and imagining ways the problem could be untangled. Over the next few days, she continued to meet with the CEO in small, informal ways. Sometimes he came to the diner, other times she sent notes through a mutual acquaintance. Each time, she presented her thoughts carefully, pointing out overlooked details and suggesting approaches that did not follow the traditional legal path. She never claimed to know everything. She only shared what she had noticed and reasoned out. The CEO began to see that her perspective was different and valuable. He started taking her suggestions seriously, quietly testing them against the existing contracts and legal advice. Meanwhile, the lawyers in the office continued to work on the problem, unaware of the quiet progress being made from below. They tried new strategies, argued over interpretations of clauses, and debated endlessly, but nothing worked. Their frustration grew, and the CEO realized that relying solely on conventional expertise had not been enough. He decided it was time to give the waitress's ideas a chance, even if it meant going against the established approach. The waitress, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to refine her thinking. She studied similar cases, read about regulations in plain language, and imagined the scenario from different angles. She used her real-world experience to understand how people might react, what loopholes might exist, and where small adjustments could have a big impact. Her approach was practical, logical, and grounded in observation. She could see possibilities that the lawyers had overlooked because they were too focused on theory and precedent. One afternoon, the CEO invited her to a small meeting with a few trusted advisors. She was nervous but composed, knowing that this was the moment to present her insights more formally. She had prepared carefully, using simple diagrams and clear explanations to illustrate her points. As she entered the room, she noticed the skeptical looks from the advisors. They were polite but doubtful, clearly questioning why someone with no legal background would be giving advice on such a complex matter. She began calmly, explaining her observations and how small details could affect the larger issue. She used plain language, avoiding jargon, and focused on logic and practical solutions. She highlighted the inconsistencies she had noticed, suggested ways to adjust the approach, and pointed out connections that had been ignored. The room was silent as she spoke, the tension palpable. Some advisors whispered quietly to each other, unsure of what to make of her ideas. The CEO listened closely, nodding occasionally, clearly impressed by the clarity and insight she brought to the table. As the meeting continued, she addressed questions with patience, breaking down her reasoning step by step. She acknowledged her lack of formal credentials but emphasized that her perspective was valuable because it came from observation, attention to detail, and practical thinking. Slowly, the skepticism in the room began to shift. The advisors started to see the logic in her approach, recognizing that her insight could complement the legal expertise they had been struggling to apply effectively. By the end of the meeting, the CEO was convinced that her approach had merit. He decided to take a calculated risk, incorporating her suggestions into a plan that could finally solve the problem. The advisors, now cautiously optimistic, agreed to support the implementation. It was a turning point, a moment where unconventional thinking met professional expertise, and the path toward a solution began to take shape. Outside the office, the waitress returned to her routine at the diner, quietly proud of the progress she had made. She did not seek recognition or praise, but she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her observations and reasoning were making a real difference. She continued to refine her ideas, preparing for the next steps and imagining how the solution could be fully realized. The CEO, meanwhile, began to implement the changes based on her insight. He coordinated with the lawyers, carefully guiding them to consider the new perspective. Slowly, the problem that had seemed impossible began to show signs of resolution. Small victories gave way to larger breakthroughs, and the office atmosphere started to shift from tension to cautious optimism. Throughout this process, the waitress remained focused and humble. She continued her work at the diner, interacting with customers, observing the world around her, and refining her understanding. She never underestimated the value of patience, careful thinking, and attention to detail. Her quiet determination and unique perspective were proving to be the key that unlocked a problem no one else could solve. As the days passed, the story of her involvement began to circulate quietly among the employees and a few insiders in the company. Whispers of admiration and surprise grew as people realized that someone outside the legal profession had contributed to a solution that experts had failed to find. The CEO remained discreet, but he knew that her role was pivotal, and he was grateful for her insight and courage. The waitress herself remained grounded, focused on the work at hand, and careful not to let attention distract her from thinking clearly. She continued to refine her ideas, ensuring that every step was logical, practical, and aligned with the reality of the situation. Her combination of observation, reasoning, and persistence was proving invaluable, and the company slowly began to see that the impossible problem might finally have a solution. By the end of the week, the CEO called another private meeting, this time with the full board. He presented the plan, incorporating the waitress's ideas, and explained the reasoning behind each step. The board members were surprised and impressed, recognizing that the unconventional perspective had brought clarity to a problem that had seemed unsolvable. The lawyers, too, acknowledged the value of her insights, understanding that her practical approach had complemented their expertise in a way that no one could have anticipated. The waitress, back at the diner, continued her routine with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She did not boast or seek recognition, but she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her observations, careful thinking, and unique perspective had made a real difference. The city outside continued to move at its usual pace, unaware of the small but significant change that had begun to take shape, all because someone had looked at the problem differently and had the courage to speak up. As night fell, the diner emptied, and she sat quietly, reflecting on the past few days. She realized that even ordinary people, working in humble jobs and facing everyday challenges, could make a profound impact when they observed carefully, thought clearly, and acted with courage. The experience had changed her perspective, and she felt more confident than ever that insight, determination, and practical wisdom could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Far above the city in the office tower, the CEO and his team prepared for the next stage of implementation. The lawyers now worked with a clearer understanding of the problem, guided by the waitress's insights. The impossible problem was beginning to unravel, and a solution that had seemed beyond reach was gradually emerging. The collaboration between conventional expertise and unconventional thinking was proving powerful, showing that sometimes the answers come from the most unexpected places. The waitress continued her quiet, observant life, her mind always active, her heart calm, and her determination strong. She had taken the first steps toward making a real difference, and the ripple effects of her insight were already beginning to be felt. She did not know exactly how the story would unfold, but she felt ready for whatever came next, confident in the value of her perspective and the power of careful observation. And in that quiet confidence, the seeds of an extraordinary resolution were taking root. The day had started quietly at the diner, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air. The waitress moved methodically between tables, refilling cups, taking orders, and greeting the regulars. But her mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the challenge she had taken on. The CEO had asked her to prepare a more detailed explanation of her idea, and today she would finally present it in a small meeting with a few of the company's top advisors. She knew the stakes were high, and that her simple, practical approach would be met with skepticism. She had spent the previous night carefully reviewing her notes, organizing her thoughts, and imagining how the meeting would unfold. She wrote down her points in clear, logical order, using simple diagrams to illustrate the connections she had noticed. She practiced explaining the idea aloud, trying to anticipate questions and doubts. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed the notes into her bag, but her mind was focused and determined. She knew this was her moment to step out of the diner and into a world she had only glimpsed from the corner of the city streets. The CEO met her at the building's lobby, his expression a mixture of anticipation and relief. He escorted her to a small conference room, where a few advisors were already seated. Their faces showed curiosity and polite skepticism. They had heard that a waitress had identified a solution to a problem that even 11 top lawyers could not solve, and they found it hard to believe. The room was quiet, with only the sound of the air conditioning humming softly. She took a deep breath and began. Her voice was calm and measured, her words simple and clear. She started by summarizing the problem, acknowledging the complexity and the previous failed attempts. Then she introduced her observation, the small detail that had seemed insignificant at first but had led her to think differently about the situation. She carefully explained how this detail connected to the larger issue, showing step by step how a practical adjustment could create a solution. She used plain language, avoiding legal jargon, and relied on clear examples and visual aids to illustrate her points. At first, the advisors listened politely but with obvious doubt. One or two exchanged skeptical glances, while others leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. The waitress noticed their reactions but continued calmly, focusing on clarity and logic. She answered each question carefully, never dismissing any concern and explaining her reasoning thoroughly. She acknowledged her lack of formal legal training but emphasized that her perspective offered a fresh view that the previous experts had missed. The CEO watched her closely, impressed by her composure and clarity. He could see that her approach was different, unconventional, and yet strikingly logical. He occasionally nodded, silently supporting her as she explained each point. He had seen enough now to know that her insight was not just a lucky guess, but a carefully reasoned perspective that could unlock a solution no one else had found. One advisor finally spoke up, questioning how someone without a legal background could fully understand the complexities of the contracts and regulations. The waitress smiled politely and responded with confidence. She explained that her strength was in observing patterns, noticing overlooked details, and thinking practically about human behavior and real-world outcomes. She admitted she was not a lawyer, but she had carefully studied the relevant documents and had mapped out a logical path that could complement the work of the legal team. As the discussion continued, the skepticism in the room slowly began to fade. The advisors started asking more focused questions, seeking clarification on specific points. The waitress responded thoughtfully, explaining her reasoning and demonstrating how small adjustments could resolve conflicts and fill gaps that had stymied the experts. Her practical, grounded approach provided clarity in a situation that had seemed hopelessly complex. The CEO interjected occasionally, supporting her explanations and highlighting how her perspective brought a new understanding to the problem. He emphasized that months of expert failure had left the company at an impasse, and her insight offered a fresh path forward. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, from polite skepticism to cautious interest, as the advisors started to recognize the potential in her reasoning. The meeting stretched for hours with careful analysis, questions, and clarifications. The waitress remained composed throughout, focused on presenting her ideas clearly and logically. She illustrated how her observations connected to the contracts and regulations, and how practical adjustments could resolve conflicts. Her calm persistence, combined with her clear explanations, gradually won over even the most doubtful advisors. By the end of the meeting, the CEO made a decision. He would incorporate the waitress's ideas into a plan, testing them carefully alongside the existing legal framework. The advisors, now convinced of the value of her perspective, agreed to support the implementation. It was a turning point, a moment where unconventional thinking met traditional expertise, and the path toward a solution finally began to take shape. After the meeting, the waitress returned to the diner, exhausted but quietly proud. She did not seek recognition or praise. She only felt satisfaction in knowing that her observation and careful reasoning had made a real difference. She continued her work, serving customers, listening, and observing, but now with a sense of purpose and confidence that she had never experienced before. In the office above the city, the CEO began to implement the plan based on her insight. He coordinated with the lawyers, guiding them to incorporate her practical adjustments. Slowly, the problem that had seemed impossible began to show signs of resolution. Small breakthroughs turned into larger successes, and the office atmosphere began to shift from tension to cautious optimism. The impossible challenge was no longer insurmountable. The lawyers, initially skeptical, began to recognize the value of the waitress's contributions. Her practical approach, grounded in observation and careful reasoning, complemented their legal expertise. They started to follow her suggestions, implementing small changes and adjustments that gradually resolved the conflicts in the contracts and addressed the regulatory issues. The combination of unconventional insight and professional expertise proved powerful, showing that sometimes the answers come from unexpected places. The waitress, meanwhile, continued her quiet, observant life, never letting attention distract her from careful thinking. She refined her ideas, prepared for the next steps, and stayed grounded in her daily routine at the diner. She knew that her insight had created an opportunity, but she also knew that patience and persistence were still necessary. Her role was far from over, and she remained focused on ensuring that her approach would succeed in practice. Word of her involvement began to circulate quietly among the employees and insiders in the company. Whispers of admiration and surprise spread as people realized that someone outside the legal profession had contributed to a solution that experts had failed to find. The CEO, though discreet, knew the importance of her insight and was grateful for her courage, observation, and careful reasoning. The waitress reflected on the experience, recognizing that even ordinary people, working in humble jobs, could have a profound impact when they observed carefully, thought clearly, and acted with courage. She had taken the first steps toward making a real difference, and the ripple effects of her insight were already beginning to be felt. She did not know exactly how the story would unfold, but she felt ready for the next stage, confident in the value of her perspective and the power of careful observation. As the days passed, the company continued to implement the plan, guided by her insights. The problem that had seemed impossible to solve was gradually unraveling, and a solution that had once seemed out of reach was becoming a reality. The collaboration between traditional expertise and unconventional thinking had proven its worth, showing that fresh perspectives can unlock solutions where conventional approaches fail. Back at the diner, the waitress carried on with her work, attentive to the people around her, and always observing the world with a keen eye. She remained humble, knowing that the success of her ideas depended not just on her own insight, but on collaboration, careful implementation, and the willingness of others to listen. Her life had changed in subtle but meaningful ways, and she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her quiet determination and careful thinking were making a difference. The city outside continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the small but powerful change taking place. The impossible problem in the office tower was no longer insurmountable, thanks to someone who had dared to look at it differently and speak up. The stage was set for a resolution that no one could have predicted, a story that would inspire those who believe that wisdom and insight are not confined to titles, degrees, or positions. And in the diner, the waitress quietly continued her life, ready for whatever came next, confident in her ability to see what others could not and to make a difference in unexpected ways. The morning of the big implementation started with a quiet anticipation in the office. The CEO and his team of advisors gathered in the conference room, reviewing the plan one last time. The lawyers, initially skeptical, were now ready to follow the steps outlined by the waitress's observations. They knew that months of failed attempts had brought them to this point, and the air was filled with cautious hope. The problem had seemed impossible for so long, and now, for the first time, there was a real path forward. The waitress, back at her diner, was equally focused. She had spent the night preparing for the possibility that her ideas might be tested in full. She reviewed her notes, considered potential obstacles, and thought through the practical steps needed to see her solution succeed. Though she was far from the office, she felt a connection to the people who would implement the plan. Her mind raced with possibilities, adjustments, and outcomes, each thought carefully weighed. By mid-morning, the CEO called a meeting to begin the implementation. The lawyers followed the plan meticulously, incorporating the adjustments the waitress had suggested. Each step was carefully monitored, with attention to detail and a focus on precision. The problem, which had seemed insurmountable, began to respond to the changes. Small conflicts were resolved, inconsistencies corrected, and gaps in the contracts addressed. Each successful step built momentum, and a sense of cautious optimism spread through the office. The CEO observed the process closely, his attention divided between the practical execution and the overall progress. He occasionally consulted the waitress's notes, ensuring that each adjustment aligned with her original insights. The lawyers, while still professional and cautious, began to appreciate the value of her perspective. Her practical, observational approach provided clarity in ways that traditional legal analysis had not. Outside the office, the waitress continued her routine, serving customers and keeping the diner running smoothly. Yet she remained mentally engaged with the implementation, thinking through each step and imagining the results. She quietly observed her surroundings, noticing patterns in people's behavior, small details that might influence outcomes, and practical adjustments that could improve the plan. Her attention to these nuances reflected the same care and thoughtfulness that had led to the solution in the first place. As the day progressed, small victories in the office turned into more significant successes. Each resolved issue brought relief, and the tension that had filled the office for months began to lift. The CEO's confidence grew, and even the most skeptical advisors started to acknowledge that the plan was working. The combination of conventional expertise and unconventional insight had proven effective, showing that sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected sources. By afternoon, the major obstacles had been addressed. The contracts were aligned, regulations satisfied, and the complex problem that had defeated 11 lawyers was finally under control. The office was filled with a sense of accomplishment, a quiet celebration of a hard-won victory. The CEO gathered the team to review the results, emphasizing the importance of every contribution and highlighting how the fresh perspective had made the difference. The lawyers, who had once been doubtful, now expressed genuine admiration for the practical insights that had guided the solution. They recognized that their expertise alone had not been enough, and that the observation and reasoning of someone outside their field had been essential. The dynamic of the office shifted subtly, as the team appreciated the value of diverse perspectives and collaborative problem-solving. Meanwhile, the waitress received a discreet message from the CEO, inviting her to visit the office to see the outcome. She felt a mix of nervousness and excitement, knowing that her ideas were about to be validated. She left the diner and made her way to the office, her thoughts focused on the practical implementation and the people who had worked to bring her vision to life. She was curious to see how her suggestions had been applied and the effect they had on the problem. When she arrived at the office, she was greeted warmly by the CEO and his team. The atmosphere was professional but celebratory, a quiet acknowledgement of the success that had been achieved. She was shown the results, each step explained and each adjustment outlined. As she listened, she realized that her observations had been implemented effectively and had indeed solved the complex issue. A wave of satisfaction washed over her, tempered by humility and quiet pride. The CEO thanked her sincerely, acknowledging her contribution in a way that was both professional and heartfelt. He emphasized that her insight had been critical in resolving a problem that had stumped experienced lawyers. The recognition was unexpected but meaningful, a confirmation that careful observation, logical thinking, and courage to speak up could create real change. The advisors and lawyers joined in the appreciation, acknowledging her role in a respectful and professional manner. Despite the attention, the waitress remained grounded. She understood that success was the result of collaboration, careful implementation, and practical reasoning. She did not boast or seek further recognition, but she felt a deep sense of accomplishment in knowing that her perspective had made a tangible difference. The experience reinforced her belief in the value of observation, clear thinking, and thoughtful action. Throughout the day, the company continued to adjust and refine the solution, ensuring that every detail was correct and that the implementation was sustainable. The impossible problem had been transformed into a manageable situation, and the office atmosphere shifted from tension and doubt to confidence and optimism. The CEO, advisors, and lawyers recognized the importance of diverse perspectives and the power of unconventional insight in solving complex challenges. The waitress returned to her routine at the diner, quietly proud but focused on her daily responsibilities. She reflected on the journey, understanding that her observations and practical reasoning had bridged the gap between theory and application. She realized that even ordinary people working in humble roles could contribute meaningfully when they paid attention, thought critically, and had the courage to share their insights. The city outside continued its busy rhythm, unaware of the transformation that had taken place within the office. The once impossible problem had been resolved, and the ripple effects of her insight were already beginning to be felt. The CEO and his team were now more open to unconventional thinking, and the lawyers had learned the value of combining their expertise with fresh perspectives. Collaboration, careful reasoning, and courage had created a solution that no one could have predicted. In the days that followed, the office settled into a new rhythm. The problem that had caused months of stress was no longer a burden, and the success brought a sense of relief and accomplishment. The CEO continued to implement improvements based on the practical insights provided, ensuring that the solution was thorough and sustainable. The lawyers, now respectful of diverse viewpoints, integrated the lessons learned into their future work, recognizing that innovation often comes from unexpected sources. The waitress, meanwhile, carried on with her life at the diner, attentive to her customers and observant of the world around her. She remained humble, knowing that her success had come from careful thinking, observation, and collaboration. Her confidence grew quietly, reinforced by the knowledge that even simple, practical insights could have a profound impact. She understood that her role was valuable, not because of a title or position, but because of her ability to see what others could not and to act thoughtfully. The CEO and his team continued to celebrate their achievement in their own way, quietly acknowledging the critical contribution that had come from outside the traditional sphere of expertise. The story of the problem's resolution became an example of how unconventional thinking, observation, and courage could lead to solutions that even the most experienced professionals might miss. The office had been transformed, not only by the solution itself but by the lesson that collaboration and openness to new perspectives are essential in overcoming complex challenges. The city outside moved on, but the impact of the solution remained. The company was now stronger, more confident, and better prepared for future challenges. The CEO often reflected on the value of the waitress's insights, appreciating the way her practical, observant approach had unlocked a solution that had seemed impossible. The lawyers, too, carried the lesson with them, recognizing that even the most skilled experts benefit from fresh perspectives and collaborative thinking. The waitress continued her quiet, purposeful life at the diner, never seeking the spotlight but always observing, thinking, and preparing for what might come next. She had proven that insight, careful reasoning, and the courage to speak up could change outcomes in ways that no one could predict. The problem that had once seemed insurmountable was now resolved, and her contribution had created a lasting impact. The city continued its rhythm, but the story of this unexpected success remained a testament to the power of observation, logic, and human courage. After the successful resolution of the complex issue, the office experienced a quiet transformation. The tension that had once dominated the halls gave way to a sense of relief and cautious optimism. The CEO moved among the employees, sharing the good news and acknowledging the hard work that had gone into the solution. But quietly, he made sure to give special recognition to the waitress whose insight had unlocked the impossible problem. Her contribution had been the turning point, and he wanted it acknowledged in a meaningful way. The waitress, back at her diner, continued her routine with the same quiet diligence she had always shown. She served coffee, wiped tables, and greeted customers with a warm smile. But now, her mind was at ease in a way it hadn't been before. She knew that her observation and careful reasoning had made a real difference, and while she did not seek recognition, the sense of accomplishment filled her with quiet pride. A few days later, the CEO invited her to the office once more, this time to formally acknowledge her contribution. She felt nervous but composed, understanding that this was an extraordinary moment. As she entered the office, she saw the team of lawyers and advisors waiting to greet her. Their expressions were respectful and sincere, a clear sign that they had recognized the value of her insight. The CEO welcomed her warmly and explained how her perspective had guided the company through a problem that had seemed impossible for months. He presented her with a certificate of appreciation and shared a small story about how her observations and practical reasoning had helped the company. The atmosphere was filled with admiration, but the waitress remained humble, quietly accepting the recognition. She did not boast or demand attention. She simply acknowledged the gesture with a grateful smile. The CEO emphasized that her contribution was not just valuable for solving the immediate problem, but also for showing the company the importance of openness, collaboration, and the power of fresh perspectives. The lawyers, once skeptical, approached her individually to express their appreciation. They admitted that her insight had challenged their assumptions and helped them see the problem in a new light. They spoke respectfully, acknowledging that her practical approach had complemented their legal expertise and had been essential in achieving a solution. The moment was humbling for her, but also deeply satisfying. She realized that even someone without formal titles or degrees could make a significant impact when they observed carefully, thought critically, and acted courageously. After the recognition event, the waitress returned to her diner, where life continued at its usual pace. Customers came and went, some chatting, others lost in thought, and she served them all with the same attention and care as before. But she felt a subtle change within herself. Her confidence had grown, not because of the recognition, but because she now knew the tangible value of her insight and her ability to contribute meaningfully. She continued to approach her work with care, observation, and thoughtfulness, understanding that her life had been enriched by this experience. The CEO, meanwhile, implemented a series of new practices in the office inspired by the waitress's approach. He encouraged employees to think creatively, to observe carefully, and to share their insights openly, regardless of their formal position or background. The company culture shifted subtly, fostering collaboration, innovation, and appreciation for diverse perspectives. The lawyers incorporated these lessons into their daily work, learning to value practical reasoning alongside legal expertise. The ripple effects of her contribution continued to shape the company's operations and decision-making long after the immediate problem had been solved. In the weeks that followed, the story of the waitress's contribution became known within the company and among a few outside contacts. It served as an inspiring example of how unconventional insight, careful observation, and courage could lead to solutions that traditional expertise alone might not achieve. Employees spoke of the lesson it had taught them, that wisdom is not confined to titles, and that everyone has the potential to make a meaningful difference when they pay attention, think critically, and act thoughtfully. The waitress continued to live her life quietly, observing, thinking, and learning from each experience. She found satisfaction in small details, in solving problems, and in helping others in ways big and small. Her humility remained, but her confidence grew steadily. She realized that her ability to notice what others overlooked, to connect details thoughtfully, and to act with courage was a gift she could continue to use throughout her life. The CEO occasionally visited the diner, not to discuss business but to maintain a personal connection and to acknowledge her continued role as a source of inspiration. Their conversations were casual, but filled with mutual respect and understanding. He often remarked that her insights had transformed the company's approach to problem-solving and had demonstrated the value of looking at challenges from unexpected angles. The waitress listened, grateful but modest, understanding that the true reward was the knowledge that her contribution had made a difference. The company itself continued to grow stronger and more innovative. The lessons learned from this experience influenced future decisions, encouraging openness, collaboration, and appreciation for diverse viewpoints. The lawyers, having experienced the value of practical insight firsthand, adapted their approaches, blending legal expertise with real-world observation. The CEO recognized that leadership required not just technical skill, but also the ability to listen, observe, and act upon the ideas of those around him, regardless of rank or title. Back at the diner, the waitress reflected on the journey she had taken. She thought about the months of observation, the careful reasoning, and the courage it had taken to speak up. She understood that her contribution had not been about seeking recognition, but about offering a perspective that could help solve a difficult problem. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing that ordinary people, even those in humble positions, could make a lasting impact through careful thought, observation, and courage. Her story became a quiet inspiration to those around her. Regular customers, unaware of the full details, could sense her quiet confidence and thoughtful nature. Employees at the company carried the lessons she had taught them into their daily work. The idea that insight could come from unexpected sources remained a guiding principle, shaping decisions and fostering collaboration long after the immediate challenge had been resolved. As time passed, the waitress continued her life at the diner, maintaining her routines but carrying with her the knowledge that she had changed lives and influenced a company through her practical insight and careful observation. She remained humble, patient, and attentive, always observing, thinking, and acting with purpose. The CEO, lawyers, and advisors continued to recognize the impact of her contribution, knowing that her perspective had been the key to solving a problem that had once seemed impossible. The city outside continued its bustling rhythm, oblivious to the quiet but profound changes within the office and within the life of the waitress. She continued to serve coffee, wipe tables, and greet customers with warmth, but now with a sense of quiet pride. Her journey had taught her the power of careful observation, thoughtful reasoning, and the courage to share her insights. She understood that these qualities could create meaningful change, regardless of formal titles or positions. In the end, the story was not just about solving a problem, but about recognizing the value of perspective, the importance of collaboration, and the impact that ordinary people can have when they approach challenges thoughtfully and courageously. The waitress had proven that insight, careful reasoning, and humility could overcome even the most complex obstacles, and her story became a quiet testament to the power of human observation and practical wisdom. She continued to live her life in the diner, always attentive, always thoughtful, and always ready to observe and act when opportunities arose. Her journey had changed the lives of those in the office, influenced company culture, and demonstrated that meaningful contributions could come from the most unexpected places. Her quiet courage, keen observation, and careful reasoning had made a lasting difference, leaving a legacy of insight and inspiration that would be remembered by those who witnessed it.